Hi everybody, this is Bentley the Compost Guy Christie here, and I want to tell you about a small do-it-yourself worm bin that I've called the Mini. Now the Mini originally came about probably about a year and a half ago, and it was just after I started up my own small worm business up here in Canada, and I didn't have any sort of a worm bin to sell to customers, but understandably a lot of people wanted to buy everything all at once. They didn't want to just buy worms and have to mess around with trying to track down a worm bin. So I decided to come up with a simple system that I could easily make, but one that would also look pretty decent and of course work pretty well as well. So this is basically how the Mini was born. As far as the rationale of why I made it the way I made it, of course it all comes down to those air vents. The bigger air vents work much better than your typical drill holes that you would have in a normal Rubbermaid system. They provide increased aeration, and that increased aeration of course provides oxygen, and this results in a faster composting process and a better quality compost. Anybody who's messed around with the Rubbermaid tubs, as I have for many years, will know that when you go to harvest the vermicompost in those systems, oftentimes you'll find that it's like a sludge when you dump out the material. The water just continues to increase over time, and this prevents the good aerobic composting from occurring down below. And oftentimes what you'll find is that there's all kinds of material that haven't been processed yet, and you have to actually let it sit and age over time before you can even use it. So that's certainly an advantage of these vents. And of course the aeration also can improve worm health. They're pretty tolerant creatures, that's for sure, but it never hurts to provide them with a bit more oxygen, and it certainly help them with breeding and just overall worm health. And as I'll explain, this bug screen that you can add can help to protect against fungus gnats and fruit flies, and these are royal pain for anybody who has had them, and pretty much everybody is going to have at least one of them at one time or another, and it's certainly something that I still get myself, and plenty of people who have been doing this for years still get them as well. So it's good to protect yourself against those. And as mentioned, there is a certain appeal to the way this system looks in comparison just to a regular Rubbermaid tub, so that has an advantage as well. So as far as supplies, these are just the supplies that I personally used. You can obviously modify this however you want, but I used a Sterilite 19-liter or 5-gallon bin, one 3-inch plastic air vent. I'll talk more about air vents in a minute. 4 1-inch plastic air vents, some heavy-duty produce elastics. Those are basically just those elastics you find on broccoli and other types of produce in the grocery store. A drill with hole-cutting bits, and a nylon stocking material for those bug screens. So here's a picture of most of those supplies. Of course, you have your Sterilite 19-liter bin, your drill, your air vents, and the hole cutting bits. Now I should mention that I don't actually use the big hole cutting bit. My drill's not powerful enough, or whatever the case. It doesn't work very well for me, and I personally prefer just to do the big one by hand. So you may want to not even bother buying one of those larger bits if you don't have one already. The smaller one I definitely do recommend, just because it's really challenging to cut those tiny holes by hand, and I find it works very well. Just something to keep in mind. Let's talk about the vents. These aren't the easiest thing to track down in the world, as I discovered. And what these are referred to are louver vents, plastic louver vents. This particular type that I'm using are called Duraflow mini louvers, and again it's the 3-inch and the 1-inch, but they go by a variety of names. Soffit vent is another one that is sometimes used, and siding vent is another one as well. I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with these, but for those of you who are like me and not all that handy, sort of it can be a bit of a challenge to find them, but hopefully I'm going to help out in that department. In Canada, Home Hardware Store carries these. This is where I get mine, and again they're called the Duraflow mini louver plastic vent, so fairly easy to track those down. In the US, you should probably go to hardwarestore.com and do a search for Maurice Franklin. Maurice Franklin is a company down there that makes these louvers. Doesn't seem to be Duraflow down there that I could find anyway. So look for the PLW 100 series, and again if you just do a search at hardwarestore.com you should be able to track those down. So we start with the vent holes, of course. So you just mark them wherever you want. Again, totally up to you where you put the vent holes. And then you just cut them out. Very, very simple and straightforward. The only thing I'd recommend with the bottom one is just to make sure you don't get too close to the bottom, because just in case there is a bit of pooling at one time or another, you obviously don't want that leaking out from the sides there. But you do want them low enough so that it's going to help to keep that lower section nicely oxygenated. So next you just insert the vents. Again, very, very straightforward. A little bit more of a hassle up top potentially, just if you do cut it out by hand, but as far as the bottom one goes, they just snap in really, really nicely, and that's basically all there is to it. Now if there is anything that needs a bit of tweaking, you can go back with a utility knife or whatever. Obviously makes sense to make it a bit too small initially, but don't worry too much about it being perfect. You can fix any looseness and whatnot using these elastics, so that is certainly something to keep in mind. And finally, we have the bug screens. Very, very easy to add these if you want to add them. Basically just put it over top of the vent and secure it with elastic. I like to have a few elastics up at the top vent, just because again that vent tends to be a bit looser and needs a bit more stability. But down below you can just use a single elastic, fold it over a few times, and that should help to protect those from any invasion. So that's it. Very, very straightforward, very easy to make. The only limiting factor might be those hole cutting bits, and I do recommend the 1-inch size. These little vents are really, really handy, and there's a wide variety of systems that you can create using them as air holes, so not a bad idea to invest in one of those small hole cutting bits. Now one thing I did want to talk about, one of my customers actually got in touch with me after buying one of these systems from me and told me about a really neat application for these vent holes. This is something I hadn't thought of in the slightest. Of course these vent holes are for aeration primarily, but what she told me was that she was draining out her excess liquid from the bottom of her bin, and I thought this was a very creative use for the vent, and certainly something that you can't do with your typical run-of-the-mill drill holes. So I thought that was a really, really great idea. So if it does get a little bit swampy down below, this is a good way to help to alleviate some of that. Now one thing I should mention, people often refer to this as worm tea. It's actually known as leachate, and it's not the same thing as high quality worm compost tea, just because the liquid is going down through a wide variety of materials at varying stages of decomposition, and it's also probably going through anaerobic zones, so it can contain some phytotoxic metabolites and whatnot. So if you are going to use it, and I do highly recommend it, but you probably should dilute it with some rainwater or some aged tap water or something, and then it should be pretty good for use, especially in the garden. You may want to be cautious with your house plants just because it's a smaller system, but it is something that you can use out in the garden and can definitely have benefits, just because there is going to be vermicompost in there, so you'll certainly get some nice stuff coming out there. Alright, and some of you all would probably know by now, there is a larger system that I came up recently called the Betomatic 6000, and of course I was just sort of horsing around, especially if you see the video. It's very much a joking sort of thing, but the system is a serious system. And this is something that's quite a bit bigger than the mini bin, so you can process quite a lot more food waste and keep a lot more worms. And it's a system that I'm going to be testing out a lot more in the next few months, so you'll certainly hear more about that. Now if you do want to learn more now, I highly recommend you go to my website and go to the BOM 6000 page. You can download the free guide there and watch the video, and this will tell you all about that system and just about these air vents and whatnot. And it's a good beginner guide to vermicomposting in general, so I do recommend that. Alright, so I hope you found this video helpful. Once again, my name is Bentley the Compost Guy Christie, and I appreciate you tuning in.